You know, we started this new sermon series last week, if you weren't here or you didn't see it, called This Is My Story. It's a little bit different from what we've done for a while, because what we're going to be doing in this series is trying to talk about topics and talk about them in a way that helps you, that helps each of us to reflect on our own journey in life and our own journey with God. Not in general terms, but that can help you to sort of look back across your own life and maybe do some processing of some of the things that have happened in your life. Look at your present and think about the things that you're navigating now, and look toward the future and wonder what hope and wisdom look like as you step from this day into the days that yet remain in your life. And so as part of that, we can't do a series like that without talking about the hard parts of the path behind us. We sang this morning, it caught me as we were singing it. We sang these words, "I know the night won't last, your word will come to pass." And that's what we hold on to as Christians, is we believe that, and when I hear that, you know what word I think of? I think of Revelation chapter 21, "Behold, I am making all things new." We believe that word will come to pass, but we also know that we've lived through some seasons that have felt like night. And we may live through some more, or you may be navigating one now. And so this morning I've invited our brother David Larson to come and preach to us some honest words about the pain and the struggle that may be in the path that each of us has lived behind us. And so David, why don't you come and share your heart and share the word with us.
Good morning. Bet you thought you were going to come to church today and be like, oh, I'm going to hear an uplifting, upbeat kind of message, huh? It's not going to be that. It's not going to be that this morning. So sorry to disappoint, but we're only here for a little bit, and we're going to talk about some challenging topics this morning, like Pastor Fran said, and I'll do my best to be gentle in my approach as I bring these things up. LifeSpring leadership has been working very diligently and purposefully to cultivate a community in which it is okay to have questions. It's okay to ask questions. A community where we can think deeply and not be afraid or ashamed of those deep thoughts. A community where we can love fully. A community where we can be our authentic selves as we grow in grace together. And I'm aware that even talking about hard things during Sunday morning at church may stir up all kinds of feelings for you that you didn't expect to deal with today. LifeSpring has a team of lay care pastors whose purpose is to provide care, support, and spiritual help to those who are a part of the LifeSpring church community. And if you're new or newer this morning, or watching online now or later, there's a chance that maybe you haven't been connected to someone on that team yet. And if that's the case, there are some connection cards in the backs of these seat pockets. I'm not sure Pastor Fran's mentioned them before. I think he missed it this morning, so I got you. And we'll ensure that you're connected. And the team has been given a heads up about this morning, about the message, about the topic. And I think some of them are going to be available for prayer after the service today. And we'll coordinate and arrange that. But if you need to pull anyone aside for that, please do. Especially if that's something you feel you need. And LifeSpring also has a community called Grace Springs Hope. And so you remember Katie, she was up here a moment ago. She runs that group. And they provide a connection for people who struggle with themselves or have family members who struggle with mental health issues. And it's also a safe and caring space for people who struggle with things like PTSD or have experienced trauma. And as always, if neither of these connection points that I've just mentioned are right for you, or for the struggles that you're experiencing, or that those things are not by themselves sufficient, I encourage you to speak with a licensed counselor or therapist. And this is a community that values your good health, your good mental health. And so That's something that's perfectly okay to do, and I know there's oftentimes a stigma about seeking out that kind of help, and really there shouldn't be. Just like you go to the doctor when you're not feeling well physically, right? So like I said, we'll discuss some challenging topics. And I know I'm repeating myself a little bit here, but it's important to be careful when we're addressing wounds. We don't want to reopen any. We don't want to make them worse, especially if we're not prepared to make them better. And so by way of a content warning, we might discuss some things. Some things like sexual assault. Some things like abuse, including child abuse. Interpersonal violence, including domestic violence. Self-harm and suicide. Death or dying. And we will also discuss sources of and experiences with distress and struggle and pain that are not so easily categorized, or they're not commonly dramatized in media and in public conversation. It could be financial issues, romantic, family, and work relationships, the stress of work and life, balancing all of that. And it is my sincere hope that in this message, that the pains and the struggles that you've experienced in the past or that you're experiencing right now are discussed respectfully and reflect the care, concern, and love that I have for you and that this LifeSpring community has for you. And there are some important caveats that I'd like to share with you before we really begin. And I know I'm doing a lot of explanations, but it's important. And so I'm going to get some background things out of the way. Some of what I will share will be out of my personal experience. Some of what I will share this morning will be shared out of experiences of family members or close friends. Or some of what I share will be not from my experience, but it could be your experience. Or the experience of someone you know and love, or the experience of someone sitting next to you this morning. I will no doubt miss something. I may miss explicitly listing, mentioning, or discussing your pain and your struggle. And so I ask for your grace in that omission. I ask for your grace for my insufficiency. And for all of what I mentioned this morning about pain and struggle, and from a human perspective, you are the expert in the struggle and pain that you've experienced and that you're going through right now. I can't tell you what you're feeling, right? So for my background, without getting into too much detail, as much as I would love to share my full life story with everyone here right now, and online, I can say that I have directly experienced some of these things. Childhood neglect, childhood physical, verbal, and sexual abuse, bullying, interpersonal violence, anxiety, ADHD, depression, addiction, suicidal thoughts, and ideation. As a combat veteran, PTSD makes 4th of July fireworks really unsettling for me. I know they're supposed to be illegal in Illinois, but tell that to my neighbors. Chronic pain, illness and injuries, financial challenges, loss of close friendships, loss of community, divorce, religious trauma, and spiritual abuse, separation from my children, death of loved ones. And I share these things not to rack up points on like a scoreboard of misery, right? We're not keeping score on this. But my hope is that even in the out loud naming of these categories, that it will both shine a light on them and demonstrate that it's okay to talk about these things. You and I may share our authentic selves with each other without shame. There's mercy and grace for you here. Our religion hinges on mercy. If we didn't extend that to one another, what are we doing? So from some additional personal background, many of you know that for about 15 years or so, I lost track, I worked in a public safety dispatch center, answering 911 emergency calls and dispatching police, fire, emergency medical units to emergency situations, right? And I can only estimate that in that career, I've answered close to 20,000 911 calls. Many of them were in progress, real-time emergencies. Not all of them. Sometimes they call in for something that is there mail today? Like, no, it's a federal holiday. Yes, people, you'd be surprised. But many of them were real. There were people in the midst of a crisis in that moment. Oftentimes that crisis was intense and loud and chaotic. And many of those memories will stick with me for the rest of my life. And many of those specific experiences are challenging even to discuss here in any real detail. It's a path that I'm on to be able to talk about them a little bit more honestly and openly. I've spoken to someone the moment before they were murdered and heard the panic in their voice. I've talked to someone whose office was on fire and they needed to be rescued, and we were able to help that person. I've spoken to someone who just woke up to the suicide of a loved one. Those are hard things. And so, despite my personal experiences and despite my professional experiences, I am certainly no expert in your experiences. All right, so that's the background stuff, right? Keeping it light. Let's start with an easy question. It's an easy, with bunny rabbit ears, easy question. It's a theological, philosophical question, and it's roughly titled, The Problem of Evil. Why is there evil in the world? Why is there pain and suffering? And if we have a good God, why do bad things happen? Anyone have an easy answer? Thank you so much. So, people, including many Christians, including me at times, maybe even some of you, have offered different answers to that, depending on the situation, depending on the conversation. So I'm going to give a few of the types of answers that exist. Some fall into a category of, you can call it biblical reasoning. Like there's some scriptural basis maybe somewhere that hints at this. Maybe it's pain or suffering as punishment by God for your sin. Maybe it's punishment by God for your ancestors' sin. Bear with me, I'm going to correct some of these. Maybe it's for your purification, your sanctification, the trials you're going through. Maybe it's the results of our fallen and sinful world. Even other reasons could include, well, God's using it to get your attention. You paying attention now? Or how can we truly know good if we've never experienced bad, right? So I'm going to address some of these pretty quickly so they don't sit and linger in our minds. For the question of punishment of your sin or your ancestor's sin, you might remember Jesus answering that very same question that his disciples had in John chapter 9. They asked, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus answered, neither this man nor his parents. He was born blind so that the works of God might be revealed in him. Jesus was saying that the question itself was irrelevant. Because look at what God is doing through this restoration. He's saying we're focusing on the wrong thing there. For the purification and trials argument, that might work on some level in some cases, depending on your perspective. But there are more times when that argument is incomplete and could even be harmful. And we don't know the mind of God and why he does those things. Suffering as a result of existence, right? That question of, well, it's just a result of our fallen and sinful world. It's the world we live in, right? That's really a cynicism, and it was captured in a movie quote from The Princess Bride, in which Wesley says, "Life is pain, Highness. Anyone who says differently is selling something." Right? That's a cynical response. And God can do any number of things to get our attention. Just ask Moses about a burning bush or about pillars of fire and smoke. Right? God doesn't need to create suffering to tap us on our shoulder. And lastly, for the well-meaning rationale of you can't know good unless you've experienced bad. I'm pretty sure, and you probably can too, know when something tastes delicious without having to taste something terrible, right? Think of the lunch you're going to have later, hopefully. Hopefully it's great and doesn't taste like garbage, right? And so we don't need to have those negative experiences in order to understand that. But this struggle to find answers to the problem of evil is such an old struggle for an answer. There's an ancient human belief and expectation that God balances the proverbial scales, that God settles debts, that God sets things right, that God gives people their just deserts, that God operates using a system of merit. Now, some of what I've just said is straight out of the Bible. For sure, there is truth to those parts. But I've purposely mixed in some things just now, a little bit off the mark. And so let's see if we can tease that apart and disentangle it. Let's ask some questions. Let's reframe those. So does God balance the scales? We're going to put a pin in that one. We're going to come back to it. That's important. Save that one. Does God settle debts? We can also ask the question, is God faithful? We just sang about his faithfulness. And we all know the good Christian answer is to enthusiastically say, yes, God is faithful. He always does what he promises. He is trustworthy. He is patient. He has endurance. Does God set things right? Pastor Fran has a translation of the New Testament Greek word that is often translated as either justice or righteousness. You may know it because it's such a good term and he shares it frequently. So it's in my notes. It's God's everything rightness. Did I get that right? Yeah. Awesome. God's purpose, God's end game, is to bring about his everything rightness. That's on his terms. So the question, does God give people their just desserts? I love that phrase, right? It makes you think of an ice cream sundae or some pie. But the question is, does God give people what they deserve? Oftentimes we can read that God is withdrawing his protection and allowing the natural course of sin to befall the person or the nation. In other words, God will sometimes permit someone's own cause to have that cause's own effect. You see, one tricky aspect to sin is that it can be like a cursed boomerang of sorts, right? You throw it, and it flies around the room or outside. Don't throw these inside, kids. Throws around, it flies in a big circle, and it thwaps you in the back of the head. Or in the case of my older brother, who, and this is a story, I didn't witness this, I wasn't born yet, but he was told by my mother not to bounce this golf ball off the concrete patio pad. Some of you might have done this and know what the result might be. And he did it anyway. And so sin is the golf ball that when thrown down with force, it's going to bounce up and split your chin wide open. Yeah? Or it's God warning Cain that sin is crouching and lurking at the door, and that its desire, sin's desire, is for you. And this is what is meant by sowing what you reap. It's the natural consequence. And so we need to be careful right here in this moment, because we're very close to doing what so many well-meaning Christians do, is to take abstract concepts like reaping and sowing and apply them to a particular, not an abstract, but a particular and a specific pain and struggle that we experience, or that someone is experiencing, or that you are experiencing. And that can cause all sorts of problems. There's likely no precise answer to the reason suffering exists, either our own suffering or someone else's pain. Free will likely plays a part, but it can't tell the whole story. God is mysterious. There's a rabbi, Daniel Polish, who wrote a book called Talking About God, and in there he wrote, "I do not believe in a God whose will or motives are crystal clear to me. And as a person of faith, I find myself deeply suspicious of those who claim such insight." And this morning, you've heard those misguided perspectives. Probably again, you probably have heard them before. You probably have heard them a lot. Maybe you tell yourself those things. And the point of this exercise of asking these abstract, big picture questions about God is to uncover something wonderful. All right, raise your hands if you've ever heard of the Beatitudes. Checking for the good Christians in the crowd. Okay. If you didn't, you're still a good Christian. It is the list. My favorite version of it is the version in Matthew, Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5. It's the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the gentle, for they will inherit the earth. Or blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God." Some version has sons of God, and it's not sons as in a gender-specific thing. It's meant to connote inheritance. Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you because of me, because of Jesus. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So did you hear it there? Did you hear some things that seemed contradictory or maybe at least surprising compared to what we talked about a moment ago? Oh, you're poor in spirit? Here's a kingdom. Kind of like Oprah. You get a car, you get a car. You're poor in spirit, you get a kingdom. You're mourning? You're going to be comforted. You're meek? You will have it all, the whole planet. Right? You're hungry and thirsty? Not for long. And there's a list that is sort of a this for that. That mercy is for the merciful. That purity of heart gives you pure spiritual vision. That peacemaking, not to be confused with peacekeeping, that's a different activity entirely, peacemaking. Building bridges, reestablishing connections and relationships. Peacemaking grants status and standing with God. And there's another part of that list that you'll be persecuted for God's everything rightness, and you'll be honored by God for it. You'll be reviled and despised and slandered, and you'll be rewarded by God for it. So God's everything rightness doesn't look exactly like that ancient, almost mechanical expectation of God balancing the scales, does it? This is God taking death on a cross and turning it into a life-giving resurrection. This is Jesus' leadership through service, not through power, but through service, that was imitated by the apostles, who then, in turn, encouraged us to serve one another in that same way. This is God demonstrating strength through weakness. Like the Apostle Paul wrote, he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you. Your power is made perfect in weakness. So I will boast all the more gladly in my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities for the sake of Christ. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong." You can see behind me here, there's a large wooden cross. in the corner of the sanctuary, and it's an empty cross, right? And there's a good deal of theology behind the display of an empty cross, especially in Protestant-style churches. Historically, one of those primary reasons is that our Christ is no longer on the cross because it is finished and he is risen. And those are both excellent reasons, right? And there's a risk, however, that we take by only visualizing the cross as empty. I'm not saying that we should change our decoration here. But the risk is that Christ suffered. He was acquainted with grief and with pain and sorrow. And we remember during Lent, leading up to Good Friday, may have been here walking the stations of the cross. And those things, those images, that part of the story of God comes to mind. But it's something that we can forget for a time, especially as we enter these summer months. God so loved the world that he became enfleshed and lived among us. And he suffered because of us. And he suffered with us. Henri Nouwen wrote something about this. He wrote, "Suffering invites us to place our hurts in larger hands. In Christ we see God suffering for us and calling us to share in God's suffering love for a hurting world. The small and even overpowering pains of our lives are intimately connected with the greater pains of Christ." Our daily sorrows are anchored in a greater sorrow, and therefore a larger hope. Absolutely nothing in our lives lies outside the realm of God's judgment and mercy. And in speaking about the new life that we have in the Spirit, Paul wrote something about this in Romans chapter 18, 16 through 18. He wrote, "It is that very Spirit," speaking of the Holy Spirit living in us, "it is that very Spirit bearing witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ. If in fact we suffer with him, so that we may also be glorified with him. And I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory about to be revealed to us." So philosophically and theologically speaking, there are two categories of justice or everything rightness, right? There's retributive and there's distributive, and I'm going to ungeek it here in a second. We could say that justice can either be an eye for an eye type of justice, like retribution, I'm going to get you back, or it is this is fair so we can all share type of justice. And something about God's everything rightness is that it's not an either or, it's a both and then some. So the challenges, the stresses, the losses, the pains, the trauma, the struggles, the everything that you have experienced and that you are experiencing right now cannot even budge the scale when it comes to the sheer awesome, grace overflowing, loving glory of God that he has in store for us. Those things that you feel, they are real, they are true, they are valid. And God will wipe every tear from our eyes, and death will be no more, and mourning and crying and pain will be no more, because those first things have passed away. That's the continuation of the verse in Revelation that Pastor Payne mentioned. And in the meantime, we here, myself included, in that we will rejoice with you. We will weep with you. We will walk with you. We will love with you. The Spirit of God is with us in gatherings like this, in the sharing of our burdens with each other. In that sharing, we fulfill that law of love. And the silence that you are tempted to have, maybe you have had, and maybe you are keeping in your pain and in your struggle, that's used against you. The enemy knows that. He's looking to separate you from close relationships, from friends, from community. He's looking to keep you unhealed. He's looking to keep you from the healing that is available through those caring relationships. And we're not always going to get it right. And so I pray for your courage for you to share. I pray for your wisdom as you listen to others. I pray for the love of God to stitch us all together for the healing of these wounds. It's not going to be easy for us. There will still, like Fran said, be dark times ahead, likely. But together we can stay connected. We can work through it. We can keep walking closer and closer to God together.